Greetings, BLS students. Welcome to another Black Love edition of the Black Love School. And today we're dealing with boundaries. And so we want to jump right in as always. And our title here is Boundaries, Creating Limits for Well-Being.
And we love to start with definitions. So boundaries are mental, emotional, or social lines that we use to mark safe and unsafe territory. So boundaries are really about the relationship you have with yourself and being able to share that with another person.
Say it again.
This is an extension of self-care. If you have not done the self-care Heartwork, feel free to check out that class in Black Love School. But really being able to know yourself, what you want, what you value, and setting your safe limits around that is very important. And the problem with boundaries is that we sometimes don't know those things. So we either don't have boundaries, or we say that we have them. We kind of know our values or our beliefs, but we don't hold on to them or honor our boundaries. The other challenge that we might have is that we might be so fluid that we don't really pick up on another person's boundaries, or we don't even ask about them. So we kind of make the assumption that whatever's good for us is good for another person, and that can be really us encroaching upon another person in various ways. So what's really important with boundaries is to first take that inventory with yourself and say, what do I value right now? What do I need right now? And this might actually change in various relationships. So as we start to talk about boundaries in this class, we want you to think about the different types of relationships that you have, because you might be great at setting boundaries at work, but then not so good in an intimate relationship. Or you might be mixed in family relationships, like good with setting boundaries in certain directions in the family, but not in others. So sometimes we have a problem setting boundaries with people who are older than us, like aunts, parents, grandparents, uncles, but we might be maybe too rigid with our boundaries with our children. So it's really important to take this information as we go through the class and think about the different kinds of relationships that you have and where you are doing well and where there's room for some improvement.
Yeah, so we start off with mental boundaries. And as we said before, it's imperative that everybody understands that boundaries serve two purposes. First of all, they want to let you know what your limits are, what is the construct of what you're engaging in, but also they keep you and others safe. Oftentimes when we think about boundaries, when I work with people or talk to people, I see the way they respond to the concept of boundaries as if boundaries is this forceful thing that they're imposing on another person, and it kind of makes them uncomfortable a lot of times. But really, boundaries are designed, as Nawasha read in the definition, really to keep you safe. So for example, when we're talking about mental boundaries, what's an example of boundaries? These are, for example, like focus questions or things that we need to avoid, in terms of our mental conditioning to keep us performing at a high level, or to keep us achieving, or to keep us loving to our fullest potential. We have to stay away from negative, disempowering, and limiting thoughts. And so we set up boundaries. And there's many different techniques like the swish pattern and other things that we can share with our BLS students who may want to come outside of the class for some one-on-one tutoring. But mental boundaries really represent the way we control our own thinking and the way we govern our own thinking around certain things. In relationships, whether we're in committed relationships and we're married or mated, or we're in that gray area, so the mind is the gray matter, or we're in the courting and dating phase, boundaries are very, very important. I was talking with a client recently, and we were talking about the idea of in courting, courting should have a structure. And I would recommend, for example, we'll deal with this much more in detail in the courting class, but I would recommend not more than one contact a week in the beginning. You don't really know the person, and even though you're very attracted, it's no um, it's no point to talk 30 times on the phone every week and whatnot just because you're excited and attracted. It's encroaching on the boundary, and it builds a false and unnatural familiarity in the relationship, and then you start to think about the person in an unnatural way. And so it's really important that we tend to our mental boundaries. What are we thinking? What should we be thinking? What should we not be thinking? um, and those things are very important around our mental boundaries.
And I would say it's a poll again, right? So you have the what am I thinking? What should I be thinking? What should I not be thinking? Those things are going to change as you develop in different kinds of relationships and as you add new relationships or new roles or responsibilities. So this is something that you're checking in with because you're thinking again, what do I what I might have needed before, I might not need right now. So there are so many different places to draw a mental boundary. And this is again your mind, your, spirit self, but it's really the information that you're taking in. So sometimes you might have a boundary on how much television you're watching or what kind of music you're listening to or just what you're entertaining as your mental nutrition. And that might change as you go through different phases. So you're really just saying to yourself, where am I uncomfortable, right? Or again, I'm assessing my needs and my values, and then I'm assessing what mental boundaries I need to uphold those values and needs.
So now we get into emotional boundaries, and I think this is a very, very, very profound idea within the intimate relationship. So much in the Black Love School, we talk about the intimate relationship because the intimate relationship is the impetus of the nation. It's the seed of the nation. The intimate relationship becomes the mated couple, which becomes the family, which becomes the neighbor, which becomes the community, which becomes the nation, right? So the emotional relationships that we have really, and the boundaries that we set on these emotional relationships really become pivotal for nation building. And we know that in the intimate relationship and even in the progression of life, the first non-physical destination that we arrive at in the 7 sevens, the 28 to 35, is emotional maturity. And of course, many of us are not achieving emotional maturity at that stage just because we don't have integrated community, which is what we are striving to build here in the Black Love School, a virtual community of like-minded people who are looking to experience an emotional freedom and a liberation in our thought, speech, and action. But in the emotional boundaries, it's important that we allow ourselves to feel and then recognize which feelings serve us and which feelings do disservice to us. But more importantly, understand how we should share our feelings. And it's really important for the men to really interpret this because, I say a lot of times, the relationship, the intimate relationship for men offers a really humbling moment because we enter into a realm where this is the realm of emotions, right? The relationship is, really, I believe, a lot of times governed by emotions. And so many men are adamantly against emotions, or the way they present is like they're against emotions. And then they enter into these relationships with the most profound emotional creature in the universe, the Black woman. And then you need to be able to, you know, traverse this wide schism of emotions, and we lack that emotional vocabulary. We lack that emotional discernment, the emotional literacy, the flexibility, the strength. Those many things that we talked about in our self care class, but just throughout our work, the ability to have a holistic emotional presentation. But our boundaries are, for self preservation boundaries. What are the emotions we want to stay away from, or how do we want to use the emotions? Because really, all emotions serve to do what good, and so there's no such thing as a bad emotion. Fear is to help us make it pay attention. And within fear are natural boundaries of not doing things without certain care. Frustration is to help us become creative. And so when we feel frustrated, we need to employ certain behavioral stops or boundaries that, we're banging our head against a wall, striving to get a thing done in a certain way, and we're not achieving that thing, with the frustration that we feel oftentimes, we get stuck. So we want to use the frustration and not have the frustration use us. If you strive to be creative, a lot of times your biggest creativity is born out of frustration from things not going a certain way. So these are just a couple of examples, but as we're dealing with another partner, we're using our emotional feelings as triggers to say to ourselves or to question ourselves, are we in a safe space? And do we need to protect something that is actually happening? I think this is very, very important communication that we are lacking a lot of times in our intimate relationships. We just assume that we're in a place or that we should be in a place. And so we have these silent agreements that we have. And oftentimes, emotionally, boundaries are crossed. And two things. Number one, we're usually the impetus of the boundary being crossed. And then when the boundary is actually crossed, we don't have the emotional literacy or the emotional vocabulary, um, the emotional communication, transference to share it with our partner in a way that makes us stronger. So the boundary is working threefold in a relationship. Me as a person, for example, are using my emotional boundaries to govern my behavior and my presentation toward Nawasha. I then am also using my emotional discernment and my ability, my emotional literacy to read what I'm seeing from her. And then, of course, asking and clarifying what it is I am seeing, or if I did cross an emotional boundary. But then as a relationship unit, we're moving in a way where we're striving to inspire various emotions like we are in the Black Love School, or we're moving in such a way that we're thinking about what are the desired emotions that we want to achieve as a couple in a unit. And so this lane of boundaries can be very obscure because again, a lot of people interpret boundaries as some forceful unit of measure that's imposed upon another person to control their behavior. But in reality, the purpose of a boundary is to keep you safe and those that you care for safe. Is no different than a fence in a yard. That is a boundary. The boundary has the dual purpose of marking your property, your ownership, your responsibility, but it's also to keep yourself safe and keep yourself contained, the level of privacy that you have, but simultaneously, it's a symbol to let other people know this is where you stop and I begin.
And then we have physical boundaries. So this is, your physical body boundary, and this can come in your personal relationships, like work relationships, with how
Hmm.
close you want someone to be to you,
Hmm.
how much time maybe you want to give to work projects, and are you able to really set great boundaries with your coworkers about, time schedules or being in your personal space. But it also can be in the more intimate sense when it comes to like sexual boundaries. If you know that there are things that you don't want to do
I
or
think that's
things
a
that
big
you
one.
do want to do, it's
Hmm.
really important to, again, examine what you value and what you want at any particular time. And I think what Masha was just saying, as we were talking about emotional boundaries, is very important for all boundaries, is your ability to communicate them, because they may change. Chances are they're going to change
Right.
as you go through all the stages of, development. You might be more exploratory at sometimes when it comes to your emotional self, your physical self, or your mental self. And then you have that more porous kind of boundary where things are coming in because you're examining the world. And then if you are a parent, you may change. If you're in an intimate relationship, you may change. As you get older, you may come full circle and be more exploratory again. So it's really important that you are able to communicate your boundaries. And as Masha was saying, you are always communicating your boundaries with an I statement. Like, I want to do this, I will not do this, and or I feel this way about this situation. And it's just, again, you're feeling comfortable because you are aware that you have a certain level of value, even to your own self. So, whatever it is that you want, if it's for the greater good, again, because culture sets the expectation for boundaries. So, we have a very, loose culture, dominant culture right now.
Right.
So, there aren't a lot of boundaries. Actually, I don't think that there are any boundaries, because a lot of times people have these expressions like, hey, whatever's good for you, or hey, you like it, I love it, and you're saying that something is not good for you, really, and you don't really know how to hold space for both of those things. And that is why we tend to have challenges. Sometimes a work environment sets the stage for boundaries because they have a human resources department. They have a little manual. You had to watch a video and sign some stuff. So that checks it checks some people's behavior, right? And it also checks how you're going to use the equipment, how you're going to use the space that you might be in, even if you're virtual, as we are a lot of times right now in our culture. So there are still some mandates, some guidelines, and some of those things start to get more and more porous and fluid as we change relationship. So if in your family, you may have boundaries about just hugging anyone or sitting on someone's lap or kissing anyone just because you're family. You may have boundaries about who can come over and at what time, right? So those are some physical boundaries that you might have. But then in your intimate relationship, where you're the most vulnerable sometimes and the most open, that's where you tend to want to be received, want to be accepted, want to be loved, where you can give in to certain boundaries. And you might not be able to draw the line with where you end and another person begins. And that's completely fine to be yourself and to be blended with another person as well, and make that third thing in your intimate relationship. So you have yourself, you have the other person, and then you have you united as your soulmate pair, as this other entity that needs to be nurtured, entertained, you know, fed, loved, and taken care of, but you don't want to lose yourself within that. And I think that men and women react differently to that. A lot of times women go all in, and kind of
Right.
lose themselves in the man. But I think sometimes men are using a lot of you statements or setting the tone for bringing the woman on